4, Paul says we're free in Christ. We're free. But now in verse 10, we see that Paul says, yes, of course, we're still restricted to the biblical ethical norms. You can't live any way you want. You can't spend your money any way you want. You have to tell the truth. You can't commit adultery, all that. So now wait a minute. Here in verse 4, we're free, he says, but in verse 10, we're restricted. We're still restricted to certain living in certain ways. And our response as modern people is, wait a minute, I thought that freedom is the absence of restrictions. I thought freedom is the absence of all constraints and boundaries and restrictions. The fewer restrictions there are, the more free I am. Freedom is not having any restrictions on anything I do. Wrong. Oversimplification. I'm here to try to show you that. Freedom is much more complex than that. Let me give you a couple examples. First of all, as you get older, as you will find, you can't just eat anything you want. And at a certain point, the doctor will say to you, now look, there's a lot of these things that you love eating, you can't eat them anymore. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to restrict your freedom. You're going to see them on the table, you're going to see them on the shelf, you're going to get near them, and you're going to have to go, no. And you're constraint. That's constraint. That's restriction. So you have to give up your freedom to eat anything you want if you want to be released into the richer, deeper freedom of good health and long life. Or if you want to, you can just eat anything you want and, no restrictions, be totally free. And then you will lose both your health and probably, have a shorter year. So you can't have them both. And obviously, the freeing, the liberating restriction of freedom is to be restricted here so that you can get that richer and deeper freedom of good health and long life. Let me give you another example. It's not as simple as just loss of restrictions. A lot of you have musical skill because this is New York City. And at some point in your life, you made a decision. And that is you were going to restrict your freedom because you were going to practice. You're going to practice every day. You're going to practice a long time every day. You're going to practice, which means all kinds of stuff that other people can do, you can't do. You don't have time. So you're restricting yourself now, but only if you restrict yourself then would you eventually be released into the far richer, deeper freedom of being able to perform, being able to express, being able to thrill a crowd, being able to compose, all kinds of stuff you could never even begin to do if you didn't restrict your freedom here. You could never be released into that freedom there. Oh, you're starting to say, okay, I see it. So this naive idea that freedom is an absence of restriction, no. Discipline, restriction, can release you into a greater freedom. So discipline is a good in itself, right? No. Oh, no. Hey, freedom is not the absence of restriction, but freedom is not the presence of restriction. In a more liberal culture like ours, we think of freedom as the absence of constraint. But in traditional cultures, there's a feeling like discipline is a good per se. Discipline's always good. That freedom comes through discipline. Really? Well, for example, imagine a young guy, 22 years old, 5'3", he's 115 pounds, and he dreams of being an NFL lineman. And because he's gone to American schools all of his life, every year his teacher has said, you can be anything you want to be. And like an idiot, he believed. And so now he gets up and he says, this is my dream. I'm going to be an NFL lineman. I'm going to practice and I'm going to discipline myself and I'm going to restrict myself and I'm going to work out and I'm going to build myself up. And he's going to waste his life. Because freedom is not the absence of restriction or the presence of restrictions. But freedom is the presence of the right restrictions, the ones that fit in with your nature, with who you are, the truth of who God has made you to be, the truth of the givenness of your nature. And it's a great mistake if you find the truth of who you are, the truth of what you've been given. See, the musician, because of her aptitude, restriction releases her. The little guy who wants to get into into the NFL, because he doesn't have the nature and the aptitude, restriction destroys him. Freedom is not the presence of restriction or the absence of restriction. It's the presence of the right restrictions, the ones in accord with the truth, who God made you to be. And then when you give up your freedom, you surrender to those restrictions, it will release you into richer, deeper freedom. The truth will set you free. This is the reason why, for example, a fish out on the grass. A fish out on the grass isn't free. A fish out on the grass has lost its freedom to move, even to live. You have to restrict the fish to the water. And in the water, its strength returns and its power returns, and it can, swim away like lightning. And therefore, freedom is a lot more complex, is it not? It's the right restrictions, the restrictions that fit in with the givenness of your nature, the restrictions that fit in with the truth of who you are and the truth of how things are. And the ultimate example of the complexity of freedom is love.